Hey, everybody, I'm Rahul Bali, and welcome to the Atlanta Press Club. I'm the politics reporter at WABE Radio. I also serve on the board of the Atlanta Press Club. Today, we're partnering with the Georgia First Amendment Foundation for our Gold Dome 2022 recap. During this event, we're going to unpack the 2022 legislative session with our First Amendment expert, along with some of my partners in crime down at the state capitol. We're going to look at the impact on government transparency, First Amendment rights, and public policy. So let me quickly introduce you to our panel and then get going. Sarah Brewerton-Palmer is an associate at the Kaplan Cobb Law Firm. She's also the Georgia First Amendment Foundation's Legislative Chair. Stephen Fowler is a political reporter at Georgia Public Broadcasting. And Maya Prabhu is the government reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I want to thank our sponsors, our board, and all of you joining us today. Now, if you have a question for me or for anybody else on our panel, type them into the chat function, and we will try to get them throughout the panel today, but definitely by the end when we hit our Q&A here at the end. You can also visit the Atlanta Press Club at theatlantapressclub.org and our friends at the Georgia First Amendment Foundation at GFAF.org. You can register for future events, and also you can donate to both great organizations. So let's get right to it. We're going to start with one of the biggest pieces of legislation that got passed, the mental health bill. It's a massive overhaul of mental health care and substance abuse services in the state of Georgia. The governor's already signed it, so there's a lot of to unpack here, especially when it comes to transparency and everything that we're going to learn. And I want to start with Maya. Maya and I, along with some of our fellow reporters, Andy Miller from Georgia Health News and Jill Nolan from Georgia Recorder, and I can name some other reporters, we were there for hearing after hearing. We heard so much. Maya, I want to start with you. Let's look ahead and figure out, what are we going to be looking for, whether it's data or action. I think let me start with one important thing. The key thing in this legislation is something that was called parity. The idea that mental health services and substance abuse services would be treated by health insurers the same way as physical health, like a broken arm. So let's talk about data and what goes next. Maya, I'd love to hear what you're going to be looking for down the road on this.
Yeah, so specifically this bill, the main crux of it was parity, to make sure that, like you said, mental health is covered the same way physical health is covered. And that has already been law at the federal level for 14 years. And, anecdotal evidence tells us that has not been being followed in Georgia, and I'm sure in other states as well. And there was no data. That the insurance providers were not collecting and or sharing data with the state or any government entity to determine whether or not parity was being followed. So what this bill does is it sets up the Department of Insurance and the Department of Community Health to receive these reports from insurance companies starting in January 1st of next year. They have to send in reports telling them how they covered different mental health and physical health things. And then the commissioners have until that summer in August to compile that information, determine whether or not these insurance companies were following parity law, were providing care at the same level to the General Assembly. And these the insurance, the commissioners of both of those agencies have the ability to go back and push the insurance companies to enforce parity with insurance companies going forward. So I'm going to be really interested to see, because in January a year, so in January 2024, those reports that the insurance companies provide are supposed to go up on the websites for these agencies. So it'll be interesting to see how closely or how far off insurance companies are from actually providing parity, beginning July 1st when this law goes into effect, what the rest of the year looks like for them as far as the care that they're providing.
And Maya mentioned something that was interesting that other people have brought up. Why are there two agencies involved? And here's why. The Department of Insurance is what regulates private healthcare companies like your Blue Cross Blue Shield, like United Healthcare. The Department of Community Health oversees the public insurers that handle Medicaid and Peach Care. So people like me and Maya, we're going to be dealing with two agencies. And interestingly, one agency, insurance, is under an elected official, John King, and Department of Community Health is under the governor's office. So it's going to be interesting to watch those reports and seeing the enforcement actions too. You may have remembered about a week or two ago, you had Insurance Commissioner King announce an enforcement action against Blue Cross Blue Shield on some different issues. It's going to be interesting to see whoever that next if Commissioner King continues and reelected, or if a new insurance commissioner comes in, to see what that enforcement action looks like. Another important part of the bill that Maya and me were covering, forgivable loans for providers. So one of the issues that was brought up around mental health care was there are not enough providers throughout the state. And in there was a few $1 million, I believe $10 million, for forgivable loans for people who get trained as new providers. Maya, this is something you and I are going to be watching again with the Georgia Student Finance Authority.
Yeah, so it's definitely something we're going to be paying attention to. There are already different medical fields in law that had these forgivable loan programs where the providers are encouraged or required, I think they're required to go to these underserved areas where, in this instance, where there aren't mental health or substance abuse providers. So, people like psychiatrists, psychologists, marriage counselors, social workers, they are eligible to have their loans forgiven, like one school year per 1 year that you work in one of these designated areas. And during the process, they added in primary care physicians, which, the chairman of the Senate Health and Human Services Committee, which this bill went through, Senator Ben Watson, is a doctor. He's a primary care physician. And during the testimony, he said oftentimes, if a lot of times people with mental health issues enter the criminal justice system, unfortunately, they end up, committing crimes, and they are handled that way. We heard time and time again that prisons and jails were the largest, mental health care facilities in the state, in the country, probably. And so, what Senator Watson said is a lot of time, primary care physicians end up being the first people who witness any type of mental health or substance abuse issues, and maybe might make the initial diagnosis or refer them to someone who can help them further. And so I think it was important to him to have primary care physicians included in people who could have their loans forgiven if they are serving in one of those underserved areas.
Let's move on to another topic. And folks, if you've got questions, you can put those in the chat. We'll jump into those. Let's move to a different topic where a lot of discussion, just like mental health, actually, there's been a lot of discussion for a couple of years, elections and voting. And it's great to have Stephen Fowler here, who by measure, and is my opinion, has done the most in-depth reporting on elections. So is Mark Nisi, Maya's colleague at the HAC, but just really diving deep. Stephen, I want to start with what actually passed during the legislative session. So because some people were confused of what actually passed this session.
So the only thing that has changed in this legislative session is additional language around the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and their ability to investigate election law violations. Previously, and with most things, the GBI has to be invited in to join an investigation or conduct an investigation. And the current reporting mechanism for election law violations goes through the Georgia State Election Board. They have about 24 trained certified law enforcement investigators that track down these alleged violations. And then they recommend that something be referred to the Attorney General's office or be dismissed or whatever. And so the law that passed, that was tacked on to a somewhat related bill, would now give the GBI the authority to initiate election law violation investigations on their own. Practically speaking, this works about the same way as the Attorney General's office now having a new voter fraud hotline, and those things will probably just be redirected to the state election board as well. And that's the only thing that passed out of the dozens of different measures, both individually filed and crafted together into omnibus bills at various points during this year's session.
Stephen, our audience, plenty of lawyers. Some of them are going to be involved with the elections. You've got obviously a lot of reporters who are tuning in here. Stephen, what should lawyers and reporters be watching for? We've only done 2 election cycles, and they were just municipal elections. Granted, one of them was the Atlanta mayor's race, but we've got major primaries coming up, probably primary runoffs, and then elections. Take us inside of what reporters and lawyers, if a lawyer says, I'm going to be at a polling location, or a reporter at a polling location, what should they be watching for? What's going to be different because of Senate Bill 202 from last year? What's going to be different kind of going in this year?
The biggest things that are probably going to change is people's perceptions about elections more so than the actual mechanisms themselves. Senate Bill 202 changed virtually every aspect of voting in Georgia. The biggest changes are with absentee by mail voting. But the way people vote in Georgia and the way they're likely to vote moving forward won't be as negatively impacted as we've seen other states. Texas, for example, had large primary rejections of absentee ballots because of their rule changes and uncertainty in how it works. The biggest thing for absentee voting in Georgia is there's a much narrower window to request an absentee ballot. There's more personal information you have to put on that ballot and that application to ensure that it is, you are who you say you are. And there's new restrictions and rules put in place for elections officials counting the ballots to do so faster and theoretically more accurately to get results quicker. But I mean, the biggest thing to watch will be how the implementation of this law affects the perception of voting. Will we see fewer people vote absentee because they think the new rules are harder? Will we see fewer people vote because the window's narrower and they go to try to request a ballot and it gets rejected because you can't request a ballot until right before the election anymore like you used to be able to? Will we see people shift to in-person early voting now that the pandemic has sort of entered a phase where people are more comfortable being out and about around people? And so I will be interested to see the turnout patterns and how that shifts, but also, as from the legal standpoint, for the last 2 years, we have found certain groups trying to exploit election laws and the way they're written and the way people understand them. And so I continue to expect that to play a big role moving forward, of people questioning results and people questioning processes based on dubious understandings of how election laws work, or just outright fabrications of how those laws are supposed to work. And so it's a lot, but luckily we have a primary and probably some runoffs before we get to the November election. So I think people will be a lot more comfortable with a new law by the time, we get the highest turnout election in November.
Let's move on to a bill that did not pass at all. I went to, I think, at least one hearing on it, and it was Senate Bill 533. And Sarah, I want to bring you in on this conversation, and it had to do with public information involving state employees. Talk to me about that bill. It did not pass, but I want to go on a deeper discussion about it. But first, tell our audience what that bill did or it wanted to do.
Sure. So it's a pretty surgical amendment to the Open Records Act. And I think when you open up the bill and you look at it, it seems pretty innocuous. It deletes a single sentence. The way that the Open Records Act is structured is it presumes all public or all government records are open to the public. And then it has a whole list of, dozens of different exemptions that carve things out of public records. And one of them is documents that identify names, addresses, cell phone numbers, things like that of public employees. And that kind of information is very commonly redacted from documents that governments will produce in response to requests for open records. The way that bill or that law currently functions is it only applies to public records that specifically identify public employees by their jobs and titles. So, if it's connected to their title, and you could, figure out, oh, this is the press secretary for whoever, and this is their home address. It's sort of meant to shield public employees from that. This bill deletes that sentence that restricts that exemption to documents that specifically identify public employees by their jobs, titles, offices. And so what it does, even though it's just a couple of words that get deleted, the First Amendment Foundation has been pretty concerned by this bill. And in case it pops up again, I've been wanting to talk with folks about it because it could create some real administrative headaches and could blow some huge holes into the Open Records Act that I don't know everybody can tell by looking at it, because effectively it would mean that, if you have water bills or property records or anything from a person who is a public employee, whether or not it says on the face of that record that they are one, that is exempt from disclosure under the Open Records Act. Agencies might not know who public employees are. They might, it's not that they would have to, or they could get in trouble for disclosing something like that. But if an agency wanted to create some issues and drag their feet, or throw up their hands and say this is too hard, we're just going to say, we can't do this request because of it might touch on records that are related to public employees. I think it could have a real chilling effect if that bill were ever to pass. And there are a lot of other ways. I think this bill is the problem I think it's trying to solve is doxing of public employees and stuff like that. But there are other ways to do that other states have done around the country. And if this bill were to pass, it would, for example, the city council water bill story that the AJC ran with a couple of years ago that resulted in some open records violations coming to light, and I believe eventually resulted in the criminal conviction under the Open Records Act of one of Mayor Reed's aides. That story would have been impacted by this bill because those water bills of city council members would have potentially been not subject to disclosure because of this type of change. So it's just something that the Georgia First Amendment Foundation has been concerned about.
And the era that we're in, the idea of doxing, the targeting of public employees, especially ones who are not elected, where is that balance of information that should be available to the public, easily available to the media? Does some of that fall on us as reporters, to where information that we get, how we use it, versus anybody can get in a freedom of information request? Where is that balance?
It's a tough thing to strike, and I think it's something that we are all grappling with year to year as technology advances and all that stuff. But I think it's helpful to figure out what the motivation is, and then try as hard as you can to make the most limited reform to achieve that motivation. So if you're concerned about doxing, you're concerned about online harassment, maybe cell phone numbers or something that are important to keep private, but things like home addresses, where there are things like property taxes, a lot of other stuff that reporters can use for oversight purposes, that stuff might be a little bit different and need to be scrutinized more in terms of restricting records that might prohibit the press from really doing their oversight role. So I think it's really case by case, but it's something that we're all struggling with as things move forward.
That is Sarah Brewerton-Palmer. She's an associate at the Kaplan Cobb Law Firm. She's also the Legislative Chair at the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, also joined by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's Maya Prabhu and Stephen Fowler from GPB. Y'all, there was a lot about education, and there have been few years where we have seen as much legislation and discussion about education, which is one of the biggest parts of the state budget. Yet a lot of conversation, and one of those bills was House Bill 1084. That wasn't the bill we were following throughout the legislature, but it was legislation dealing with transgender girls playing in girl sports. And, that bill had come and gone, disappeared. At some point, we thought it was dead, but then late on the final day, on sine die, it came back to life at the end of the day, added to a bill that dealt with divisive education concepts. We'll talk about that in a second, but Maya, explain to our audience kind of what's happened, how that football kind of, no pun intended, but how that football's kind of been kicked outside of the legislature.
Yeah, so like you said, it started as a straight out restriction on children from playing sports that were not in line with the gender that was denoted on their birth certificate. And that bill passed the Senate, it went over to the House and just kind of sat. About halfway through the day on the last day of session, the sponsor of that legislation, Senator Marty Harbin, introduced, or he was going to add an amendment to another bill that had something to do with education. And there was some discussion after those amendments. We're lucky in the Senate that the amendments get passed out and the press gets copies of them as well. So the amendments hit our desk, and within minutes we saw, some leadership speaking with Senator Harbin. And shortly after that, when that bill came up for discussion, he withdrew the amendment. And the understanding was that there was a compromise. There had been an agreement reached regarding some type of study committee. So fast forward to 11:45, when session is technically supposed to end at midnight, though we all know it never actually does. So it's 11:45 and I am sitting in the Senate, another reporter sitting beside me listening to the House, and he's like, wait, they just added transgender to divisive concepts. And we're like, what? So we don't know what the amendment says, because it was introduced over in the House. So we haven't seen it yet. They vote on it, it passes, they send it back over to the Senate. I run over to the House, because the House has then gotten copies of the amendment, and make it back for the debate in the Senate when it gets called up for a vote. And they haven't even received the amendment yet in the Senate. It hasn't been printed. They don't know what it looks like. And they're basically asked to and end up voting on a bill and have no idea what the language says. And so what the amendment did is it created an oversight committee that's part of athletic associations, like I always forget, Georgia High School Sports Authority. Yeah. And
Georgia High School Association.
I'm so bad with acronyms. So, it creates an oversight committee set up within that body that is to study what it means to have transgender girls play girls' sports. And then if they find that it's something that needs to be restricted, they are to make recommendations to the authority to put those types of restrictions in place. So people were very concerned. I've even seen some campaign materials from some Republicans saying we ban transgender sports. And I'm like, well, not exactly, at least not yet. So it'll be interesting to see what this oversight committee, which has, appointed members from the governor, lieutenant governor, from the House, and some other members on this panel, what they end up deciding. I feel like the high school authority has wanted to avoid getting into regulating transgender athletes. No one on either side of this issue has been able to bring forward an example of an instance where transgender girls are playing, public school sports in Georgia. So we'll just have to watch and see what comes out of this oversight committee, and if the high school association decides that it's something that they want to actually regulate and enforce.
My WABE colleague, Sam Gringlass actually talked to the GHSA executive director, Dr. Robin Hines, and between the lines, you can tell this was not something that they were looking for. The words that Dr. Hines used was they would have preferred if a mandate had been basically given to them. So it's going to be interesting to see, because the GHSA is not a state organization, and as somebody who's covered him from time to time, not on a regular basis, you are able to get interviews with them, but it can be a challenge covering the GHSA. And so it's going to be interesting to see how they handle it, how this oversight committee handled, and as Maya pointed out, how it's going to be handled on the campaign trail. I do want to talk about some of the other education bills. Senate Bill 226, which dealt with harmful materials in libraries. Sarah, this was a bill that you guys were following. Explain what the bill does. It did pass, and what you see happening with it.
Yeah, so it requires local school boards to create a review process, essentially, and so it's got some local control flavors, like a lot of stuff did this year, of the legislature making some mandates for local boards, but they have to create a process whereby a parent can complain about reading materials in schools and school libraries, and it sets a lot of pretty onerous requirements on school administrators and library staff to review complaint about materials within, I think, 7 business days of the complaint coming in initially, determining whether it meets the criteria in the bill. It's the language of it tracks sort of the First Amendment test for obscenity, or at least it tries to, about works that are patently offensive to prevailing standards in the adult community, lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, that sort of stuff. That's all drawn from Supreme Court cases about the First Amendment's obscenity, ability to regulate obscenity. So the school administrators and library staff have to review anything that's complained about, come to a decision about whether it meets those criteria, whether it can stay in the school library. I think a lot of the concerns are pretty obvious, that the issues that have been going on about education for what feels like quite a long time now in the country, in terms of the chilling effect that could have on school library decisions about what books to buy. But I think there's also the practical concerns of the way that the bill is structured is going to require potentially a lot of work from staff and from principals who are already very, very busy solving a lot of other problems in schools, having to review these books within a very short time frame. And something Rahul and I were talking about earlier today, we've seen in other states where I think it was Virginia set up a hotline for reporting certain things coming in, or that parents were complaining about in curriculums. Those can often turn into situations where parents, on the left side and the right side, both flood these hotlines or these avenues for complaints, in an effort to sort of make a political statement. And that, I think, has some serious potential if things snowball in certain districts, in certain areas where there's a lot of conflict over this stuff, to a point where it creates a pretty big administrative headache for principals and library staff who have to do this stuff in a tight turnaround. So that's more of a shorter term problem, because I don't think that kind of stuff might be happening 10 years from now. But as this law rolls out, I think there could be some real hiccups. And then there's obviously, the chilling effect on what students have access to and the kind of books that are available in schools. And yeah, so we were disappointed to see that one pass.
I want to talk about education, some of the other education bills, but also in the context of the election. You also had in the original intent of House Bill 1084, which banned what are called divisive concepts from being taught in school. And one of that kept getting mentioned was the idea of critical race theory, which is, generally taught, in colleges as part of kind of like within, history and legal, but not as much in schools. And also you had the Parental Bill of Rights, which also passed, House Bill 1178, which again, these are parental rights that already existed. And you basically, again, put in a process that involved principals and in some cases the school board. All of these bills put together, Stephen, what is that looking like on almost the campaign trail?
Well, I mean, you have to look at this through the lens of it being a campaign year in a state that is divided by the slimmest of margins, in a state that has Republican primary challengers seeking to unseat Republican incumbents for not being conservative enough in their governance. And that's why we're seeing these bills like the Parental Bill of Rights and the so-called divisive concepts ban as a way to first and foremost burnish primary credentials, show that you're a strong conservative, show that you're, advocating for what the grassroots want and what parents want. And some of the biggest backlash we're seeing in education in Georgia are in conservative school districts that are, that have conservative school boards and overwhelmingly conservative parents and students that are trying to say that, these concepts, which don't necessarily exist, are being taught in these schools. And so it's just, it's an interesting, you have to look at this through a campaign lens more than an education lens, more than any other lens, because you've got people that are trying to go and prove that they're the most conservative. And that's why these laws are being proposed, these laws are being passed. There's not an epidemic of critical race theory being taught in Georgia schools. There's not critical race theory being taught in, Georgia's northern suburbs that are predominantly conservative. But it's an issue that makes people think it's happening. And there's a lot of people that are, another way of looking at it is, there's a lot more people paying attention to what's going on in politics right now. There's a lot more people paying attention to what's going on in education right now and what's going on in their schools and in their children's lives. And a lot of it is backlash to non-existent threats. But you're seeing these bills, you're seeing this primary lens of things because there are people paying attention to what's going on in Georgia at nearly every level of the political process. And so these education bills are an outgrowth of that, of, people that maybe didn't pay as much attention to local school board elections being really zeroed in on who's representing them on that school board and what decisions they're making. And same with their lawmakers. You wouldn't necessarily say that the number one reason people vote for a lawmaker is their thought on what type of book should be in a school library, but now that's something to consider in these primary races.
Lance, I'm going to jump in the chat. And by the way, if you've got a question, you can jump into the chat feature and put that question there. Jean Dufort has a question. It looks more like a statement. In a year when a comprehensive mental health bill did pass, what was the driving political decision behind the anti-trans language, addressing a problem that doesn't appear to be active in Georgia, and knowing trans kids are more likely to be bullied and commit suicide than their peers? So, as Maya mentioned, this does not seem to be an issue that seems to be happening, that's either happening on any major level or even in single digit case level in Georgia. When I asked that question to lawmakers who supported it, here's their response. Their response was, what about being fair to kids who could be affected by it? That was their answer. So you had both sides making a self-esteem argument, both sides making a mental health argument. But I think in the end, what Maya pointed out is we don't know of active cases where this is a situation. Maya, did you want to jump in on that question? Because again, this was a question we were asking people a lot of.
Yeah, I think the desire from House Speaker David Ralston had been not to touch this. He did not have an interest in picking this, in moving this bill forward. But you had, like we were talking earlier today, when we have the governor go on lawmakers and say, saving girls sports is one of the pieces of legislation that I still need the General Assembly to get this done. And then he came into each chamber and made comments, on all the work they had done and said, we still need to pass Save Girls Sports. And so I think that, additional nudge from the governor at the late that late hour kind of pushed things into this, what folks are calling this compromise that they came up with. My understanding is that Speaker Ralston kind of had this language on standby just in case he would need it, because it was not his desire to pass something that was a full out ban. And, talking about the mental health aspect, that was something that was brought up a lot during debate. And you saw that in a lot of instances, these kind of contradictory pieces of legislation being pushed by the Republican majority that necessarily didn't go together. How can you say that this is the year of mental health and we care about the mental health of all of Georgia's citizens, and then turn around and pass something like the commenter said, is known that trans youth harm themselves and commit suicide at a much higher rate than the rest of the general population. They weren't able to come up with a good answer for me for that. They just said that this is about fairness and having a level playing field, the buzzwords that everybody likes to use when we're pushing legislature through the General Assembly. So yeah, it will remain to be seen. I think just passing this compromise does have some effects on trans kids who might be worried about what comes next. But at the end of the day, that what actually passed doesn't do anything yet. So I guess we'll see what happens as things move forward.
I want to talk about another hot button topic, a hot button topic that will be in the news tomorrow, and that's guns. As Governor Brian Kemp will sign Senate Bill 319. Going back to you, Maya, tell our audience what Senate Bill 319 does.
So basically, at the end of the day, what it does is it rids the state of the requirement to get a concealed carry license in order to carry concealed in Georgia. Right now, folks have to pay up to $75, go to their probate court or to the sheriff's department and fill out this concealed carry license application, where a background check is run. They do their fingerprints to make sure that this person is in fact eligible to carry the weapon. So what this bill does, it gets rid of that requirement. So people can concealed carry as long as they are a lawful weapons holder, I think. Well, lawful weapons carrier maybe is the term that they came up with. And so there are instances in which, legally, Georgians are not allowed to carry firearms. If you've been convicted of a felony, if you have, certain domestic abuse things in your record, history of being involuntarily committed, things like that. And so I guess under this law, if you know that you're one of those people, then you shouldn't carry a handgun on you. Now the question becomes, do these people know whether or not they're a lawful weapons carrier? There was discussion during the debate about, I think it was like 2,500 people who filled out the applications and did the process to become a concealed weapons carrier, only to be denied because they had a criminal history. And the conservatives who were pushing this measure see the system works. When you buy a weapon, you still have to go through a background check. So those people would get caught there. But then on the other hand, there is the instance of, I'm pretty sure that these people would not have applied for a concealed carry permit if they knew that they legally couldn't. So so that's what it does at the end of the day. It doesn't change a ton, it gets rid of this fee. And the process stays in place because, in that law, it also included, nationwide reciprocity, which means if I have a concealed carry license in this state and there's another state who recognizes it, I can conceal carry there as well, and vice versa. So the permitting process stays in place. It just isn't required anymore. And the governor is going to be signing that bill tomorrow.
And that was one of the key things. A lot of people asked me, were the permits going to go away? The permits don't go away because it gives the ability, most importantly, to carry that weapon elsewhere where there is reciprocity. I do see our chat is filling up with questions. I do want to get to a couple other bills really fast before we get to those questions. Senate Bill 171, which deals with, with free speech, especially with protest, with assembly. Sarah, talk about that real quick. That bill did not pass, but talk about what that bill would have done and what your concerns with that bill were.
Yeah, that bill, it did a lot of different things. Principally, it required a permit for any gathering, and it increased penalties and created some new crimes for people who have any, I guess, committed any violence in the middle of a protest is under the language of the bill. And at one point, I don't know if this made it into the version that is currently the current version, but there were expanded self-defense rights for people who felt threatened by a group of people that didn't have a permit to gather. I think it's clear that this was all aimed at some of the protest activities that we saw in 2020 after the George Floyd shooting. So, I think this bill has a lot of problems. Once I'm going to talk about chilling effects in every answer I have today, but I think that's what a lot of these bills are intended to do is push against the limits of what the First Amendment allows you to do in order to chill people from exercising those rights, even if you can't actually prohibit it. And this is, intended to make it much harder for people to have impromptu protests, to exercise their right to assembly, and see the kind of mass demonstrations that we saw in 2020. So I think this bill's very subject to legal challenge, and if it did ever pass, would probably be held up in the courts for a bit. But in terms of messaging and what it says about the priorities of the legislature, I think the bill's very, very concerning in that regard, in terms of Georgians trying to exercise their First Amendment rights to speech and assembly. So a lot of problematic aspects of that bill.
I'm going to hit a couple other bills really fast, and then I'm going to try to get to as many questions in our Q&A as possible. Medical cannabis. And that was another story that I was following. It was a very big mess in the legislature. You had so many bills flying around. Here's the short story on that. A couple of years ago, Georgia legalized the possession of medical cannabis oil for 17 medical conditions. There are more than 20,000 Georgians on that on the medical low THC medical patient list. And while it legalized the possession, it didn't legalize the sale of it here in the state of Georgia. You can't buy it. There was this whole system put together to have growers here in Georgia who could grow it and produce it. There's been challenges. Those bills in the end all failed. And at this point, the goal of the state of Georgia is to have 6 licensees awarded and finalized here in the next couple of months to get the low THC oil produced this year. But will there be legal action? This has been a challenge to cover because of transparency issues. Sarah, real quick, talk about the transparency issues, especially for those who won and those who didn't win. And then Maya and Stephen, if you want to jump in, and then we'll try to get to as many questions as we can.
Yeah, one problem with the way that the law is currently written is that it does not track the way that transparency is handled in these situations typically. So usually when you create something like this, you'll have it track the Open Records Act and track, the way that we deal with awarding contracts and privacy and, protecting commercial interests in those respects. And this bill doesn't really do that, or the existing law that was passed a few years ago doesn't do that. It has pretty sweeping protections for the records created by the process of selecting the folks that got these licenses, and has resulted in a lot of reporting problems for you guys, because you can't get a lot of the records about who these companies are, what did they submit. There's sort of a presumption in the way the law is right now that all that stuff is private and can't be requested under the Open Records Act. And the way that it's written, I think is allows a lot of room for those provisions to be interpreted very broadly. And we've seen, that has resulted in a lot of issues with transparency in the process. The bills that were up for consideration would have changed that law to have it more track the Open Records Act, which, those exemptions are a lot more considered, and they're older and they're a lot more limited than what's in the current law. and would have sort of flipped the presumption from everything is, not available for disclosure to we presume it's available, but there are these limited exceptions that you have to apply. So that would have been, I think, would have made the process a lot easier to have some public scrutiny on, but those did not pass. So as it stands, it doesn't seem like we're gonna ever get much information about what happened.
And while there was no legislation dealing with the massive riveting project east of Georgia, that's another area that we're going to be watching for issues around transparency and what the state of Georgia incentive package is going to look like beyond what was in the state budget. Final question for everybody. Kind of a general question about challenges covering the legislature, specifically when bills are changed or bills are amended or committee times change. I know Stephen, you're always, and I want to ask that from the point of view of Stephen and Maya as people who are inside the building, and then Sarah, someone who's outside the building. So Maya, talk about the challenges of covering the legislature. And you mentioned some of them kind of around what was going on with transgender kid and sports bill.
Yeah, there are multiple ways for sneaky tactics to happen at the legislature, especially as we get toward the final days, or even as we get toward crossover. We have meetings, popping up with no agendas, meetings not being advertised at all, rooms changing. I think it was the Thursday before the end of the legislative session, there was an agenda, or there was a meeting listed for House Health and Human Services. The agenda was TBD. About an hour before the meeting was supposed to be held, I saw the chairwoman and I went over to her and I said, "Hey, have you set the agenda for your meeting later this afternoon? It hasn't been updated online." And Representative Sharon Cooper, she looked at me, she said, "I know." "Okay, so have you set the agenda?" And she just said, I was like, "Oh, okay, so that's how we're gonna handle this." I was in the Rules Committee, the Senate Rules Committee, that was setting the bills for debate for the next few days. And so I stayed there, but my colleague went, and what they were hearing was a bill that ended up not passing, but a bill that would have restricted the abortion pill. The Biden administration changed a regulation so that those pills can be sent after someone who's pregnant sees someone through telehealth and can be sent to them through the mail. This bill would have required them to go in person and pick up their medication in person as well. And so that was just like late movement, really quick. They're pushing it out of committee, potentially setting it up for floor debate, but it never did get to the floor. But that's just one example of how, even when you find the chairman and ask them what's on the agenda, they will not tell you.
Let me, a political question, and I had it here right a second ago, and I do apologize for whoever asked the question because I had it here a second ago. Did Governor Brian Kemp get everything he wanted? This was actually a discussion point on the radio last week. From everything I can tell, and Stephen, why don't you jump in here? Oh, wait, I apologize. I didn't get to Stephen on my other question. Stephen, talk about the challenges of covering the legislature, specifically around committee times and bills changing. That's something you saw a lot, especially with elections last year.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say quickly, only a small handful of people know what's actually going on from the legislative side, and they don't want to tell you what it is. Luckily with election bills, I had multiple different avenues of people sending me the bills that were actually being discussed, the different versions of bills that were being discussed, things that were left out or not left out. But I mean, even some of the people that are on the committees don't know what they're voting on or what's being discussed. Sometimes things change in real time where they'll offer an amendment and then they'll look over at the legislative council and be like, "Hey, can you write that up?" And it's like furiously scribbling notes, like hodgepodging bills together. But I mean, it's discouraging from the stance of people who cover this and have to do this every day. But then members of the public that try to show up and keep up and testify and things, or people who can't come to the Capitol and have to rely on us to know what's going on at the Capitol. It really disincentivizes paying attention when there's all of this stuff done in secret and obfuscation. I mean, even in the final 30 minutes of the session last week, I asked a senator about an election bill coming up, and this was a very prominent senator who had a position to know what was going on. And he was like, it's a distinct probability that it possibly might happen. And it's like, okay, all right, sure.
I'm pretty sure I got that same answer to that same question. Sarah, as somebody who's not who's not from the outside, but you're looking at a different point of view, talk about the challenges from where you sit when you're trying to figure out what's going on, even on a normal day, much less day 40.
Yes, it's near impossible on day 40 from outside the building. Yeah, I mean, I have a day job, and a very time-consuming one, but I try and, during session, keep tabs on things for the First Amendment Foundation. And we've been really lucky this year to partner with the University of Georgia Law School's First Amendment Clinic has lent us 2 students to help us track bills through the legislature, but they're obviously based in Athens, and I am not able to go to the Capitol that frequently. And so, it's really challenging to try and figure out what the heck's going on down there if you can't go talk to people. And, I think that just discourages citizen participation. And it's also, frankly, ironic in a world where the legislature requires every other meeting body in the state to comply with the Open Meetings Act, post their agendas ahead of time. We all understand the importance of that for encouraging public participation and making sure that the public is able to scrutinize the legislative and executive processes. And it's, I think, a shame that the legislature does not impose even at least some of those rules on itself.
Okay, I want to try to fire through as many of these questions in the chat and the Q&A as we have. Curious about this is from Rachel, curious about the campaign element of the season, especially for Kemp. Did he get everything he wanted, and how much of that thanks to Speaker Ralston? In my opinion, based on, and what I base this on is his State of the State address, and then the address he gave at the Eggs and Issues breakfast at the Fox Theater in front of the Georgia Chamber. In my opinion, Governor Kemp got everything that he asked for in those speeches. And you have to thank the speaker, because the House Speaker, David Ralston, is the one person who can stop any piece of legislation. Most other lawmakers you can work around, but you can't get around the speaker. And so I would definitely say the speaker, and the example Maya gave was the idea of with 5 hours to go, the governor saying, I want the bill, the fairness in sports bill to get done, and then it gets done. Let's get to some of the other questions here from an anonymous attendee. Climate change is hurting us now. Farmers, consumers, beach communities, those who work outside outdoor sports. The legislature has not considered any bills for climate. When do you think that might change? I don't remember any climate change bills this time around. Really not many environmental bills. Last session, we had some coal ash bills. That's really going to depend on the electorate and who's, in my opinion, who's in the legislature, or if environmental issues affect enough districts. So to answer that question, any of you guys want to chime in on that?
I mean, yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's going to, for whatever reason, Republicans who do not live on the coast don't seem to have an interest in doing anything that has to do with climate change. So that is going to come from a change in the makeup of the body. That's one mostly it.
Anybody else want to jump in? Okay. Next one. Can you address House Bill 1, the prohibition on free speech zones on college campuses? Sarah, did you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I don't have as much background on that one. It's obviously been a hot topic issue for a couple of years now, and there's some real legal challenges available to any bill that tries to do stuff like that. So that's probably the first thing that would happen when that passed, and then the courts would figure it out.
So I'll chime in on House Bill 1, which was by State Representative Josh Bonner. It's really, to me, going to come down to how it's implemented by the Board of Regents. How that's handled, how it's implemented, that's really, that's how you're going to figure out the impact. And then to hear from the camp. And then if there are lawsuits on how that's handled, that's definitely something that we're going to be watching for. Anybody else wanted to jump in on that one? Real quick, a question for you, Sarah, on that. When there is a free speech lawsuit, is that something you're going to jump in when someone approaches you and said, I've had an issue with speaking on a campus, or is this much more you guys would proactively go? How does that generally work, or does it just depend?
Yeah, there's two types of ways you can do it. You can do it when someone gets in trouble for violating something, and that's called an as-applied challenge. And you can also do it, on behalf of just sort of a group of people that might be impacted by that, who are interested in challenging it before it really goes into effect. And with high-profile stuff, a challenge before it goes into effect often is what happens. But for something that's more on the line, or it kind of depends on how they choose to enforce it, that might be the kind of thing where you wait until someone gets in trouble or gets denied the chance to speak, something like that. But it really just kind of depends on the strategy of the organizations and the people who might have an interest in challenging it, if the ACLU, for example.
Question from Janet: what rights do girls have in girls' sports to protect their rights for equity, given scholarships may be offered based on high school competition? Lots of talk about transgender rights. What rights do girls have? That's actually what me and Maya talked about earlier. That was one of the discussion points from State Representative Phil Singleton, from Senator Marty Harbin, who were behind those bills. Again, the other side of that argument was, is that even an issue happening in Georgia right now? So again, as I think I said earlier, you saw that discussion point, the idea of fairness and self-esteem and mental health brought up on both sides. You saw it, discussed on both sides. But in the end, the push, because Republicans had the power in the legislature, they were able to push through that bill. Let's see what other questions we have. I know, we're running out of time here too. I'm going to try, with us running out of time, I do want all of our great panelists to kind of give a couple of sentences to wrap up. Let me start with the AJC's Maya Prabhu, who we sometimes sit next to each other in the state Senate. Sometimes she wishes I didn't sit next to the state Senate. Wrap us up here about this session and what you're kind of going to be looking forward to here the next couple of months.
I feel as though I spent this session ignoring the campaign season. That is my primary focus heading into the primary, no pun intended. I'm covering several of the statewide down ballot elections and most, if not all, of the legislative elections. And so I am throwing myself headfirst into all of that and all of the fun and craziness that comes along with being on the campaign trail. So that's my immediate plans. Once we get past the primary and runoff, I'll have some time to switch back to some of these legislative issues. I definitely want to do more delving into the mental health bill and how that will be implemented and what it's aiming to fix, what the problems are currently. That's my intent once we get past the runoff. But yeah, those are the two big things. I want to do a lot around mental health. There are tons of stories to be explored on the mental health bill, and figure out, who the Republican and Democratic candidates will be heading into November.
Stephen Fowler from Georgia Public Broadcasting, wrap us up here on what you're going to be doing the next couple of months.
Yeah, I'm going to be looking a lot into the impacts of voting laws on the primary election and the runoff, how any of the voting changes might hamper turnout, how the continued false claims about election fraud might hamper turnout, really digging into the pro-Trump slate and their successes or failures in the primary. And really, with the legislative session, the overall theme of the legislative session has armed both parties with exactly the type of messaging they want heading into a competitive election cycle, to be able to motivate voters and say, this is what we did, or this is what we're fighting against. And, you couldn't have, I mean, if you're a Republican, you couldn't have asked for a better session in regards to the things that the governor wanted and passed. And if you're a Democrat, you couldn't ask for a better session to illustrate why you feel that there needs to be more Democrats in the legislature making decisions on bills.
Sarah Brewerton-Palmer, Georgia First Amendment Foundation Legislative Chair, give us what you're going to be focusing on the next couple of months now that we're out of session.
Yeah, I think the organization will be focusing on, how a lot of these bills get rolled out. There's the reports that are coming out from the mental health care bill that Maya mentioned next year or year and a half. And what kind of transparency issues come up with some of that data? How does the library bills actually get implemented? A lot of that stuff. I think there's going to be a lot of prickly issues that might come up that the GFAF can help out with in terms of making sure that citizens have the ability to exercise First Amendment rights and get government records. And then looking ahead to the election, we'll see what kind of impact November has on next session. So.
And I'll wrap up here real quick. Very much like Maya, my almost 99% attention was on the legislative session. After the legislative session got out last week, I took a few days off, but I hit the campaign trail today. So it's May 24th is right around the corner. June 21st, the runoff date's right around that corner, and then November is down the block from there. But it'll be here pretty quick. So. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank you for joining us, for those in the audience. I want to apologize to all the questions that we did not get to. There, I see 3 or 4 great questions we just didn't have time to get to. Thanks for those questions. I want to thank all of you for supporting the work of the Atlanta Press Club. Thanks to our partner, the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. This event will be available to view later online. For more information, go to both of our websites, GFAF.org, that's for the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, and the Atlanta Press Club at atlantapressclub.org. I'm Rahul Bali, politics reporter for WABE Radio. Thanks for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day.